If you've ever wanted to drive around a living room that handled more like a sports car than the average living room, there is now a Mercedes AMG for that. This is the 2021 GLS 63 AMG. In this video, we're going to be talking not just about this GLS 63 model, but also the more popular GLS trims, the GLS 450 and the GLS 580. 14 years ago, when Mercedes launched the very first GL, its mission was a little bit different than the GLS that we see before us here. Back in 2007, it was logically considered to be an Audi Q7 competitor, but this is really not in the same class as the Q7 anymore. This is significantly more expensive. It also is notably larger. It's about 6 inches longer overall than the Audi. In reality, the Q7 is more of a BMW X5, more of a Mercedes-Benz GLE competitor, both on overall pricing and overall exterior size, and this is in a different category. This is up there with the BMW X7, which is also relatively new, and of course something like the Cadillac Escalade or the Lincoln Navigator. Even if you want to stretch things out to include entries like the Lexus LX or the Infiniti QX80, this is still a very small and specific segment. Someone that's looking for a big 3-row SUV with all the luxury gadgets and goodies on the inside and is willing to pay Mercedes-Benz S-Class prices for it. Because this is going to start right around $75,000, and as we are looking at right here, it's nearly $160,000, and this doesn't have all the options on it. At just over 205 inches long, this is again about 6 inches longer than the Audi Q7. That's why this is in a different category. This is a little bit longer than the BMW X7. It's about 2 inches longer overall, but it is 6 inches shorter than the brand new Cadillac Escalade, which is new for 2021. Now, the big difference between this and the X7 and its most direct competition in the segment is that this is, in the truest sense of the word, a crossover. Now, to be honest, the difference between crossover and SUV really ends up getting lost in marketing, but most folks say that an SUV is a body-on-frame vehicle, which is what the Cadillac Escalade and the Lincoln Navigator are, and this is a unibody vehicle, so some folks would like to call that a crossover. Now, the big benefit to making this a unibody rather than Mercedes creating a body-on-frame SUV is that there's an awful lot of space efficiency going on. Again, this is 6 inches shorter than the brand new Cadillac Escalade. It is also shorter than the previous generation Escalade overall, but we get a significant amount of room on the inside. We have almost exactly the same amount of combined legroom as we find in the Lincoln Navigator short wheelbase, even though this is definitely easier to park. You'll also notice this when you hop on the inside, because we don't have as high of a step to get into this, even though we have about the same kind of ground clearance that we find in those larger body-on-frame SUVs. So you can see that the step-in height really is not terribly high, and you really would be hiking your leg an awful lot higher up to get into something like that Navigator. Mercedes opted for a relatively simple overall design in the back. We have a pretty vertical rear hatch, which definitely improves cargo practicality, and tail lamp modules that definitely look like the rest of the Mercedes lineup. Since this is the AMG model, we of course have these enormous exhaust tips down there at the bottom. They're quad functional exhaust tips, well integrated parking sensors, and the other thing you'll notice back here is that it seems a little bit on the narrow side. Now, there is definitely some packaging efficiency for the overall design of the GLS, but it isn't going to be quite as wide as something like a Cadillac Escalade. So if you're looking for an extraordinarily wide interior, especially in the second row or third row, you will find a little bit more width in those bigger SUVs out there. The most logical reason for that, of course, is that the GLS is sold worldwide, and in a lot of countries out there, the Navigator and the Escalade are just too big. As you'd expect out of a modern Mercedes, there are a ton of different power levels coming from under the hood. The model that we're driving is what you'll see on the side of your screen. It's a twin-turbo V8. It's an AMG hand-built engine. It produces 603 horsepower and a whopping 627 pound-feet of torque. There's also a non-AMG version of this engine that'll produce 483 horsepower and 516 pound-feet of torque. You'll find that in the GLS 580. If you opt for the Maybach version, then this engine produces 550 horsepower and 583 pound-feet of torque. There's also a base 3-liter twin-turbo V6 if you can't afford the V8 that'll produce 362 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque. An interesting twist is that all GLS models sold in the United States will technically be hybrids, albeit mild hybrids. Mercedes is sandwiching a 21 horsepower pancake motor between the engine and the transmission that can also deliver 184 pound-feet of torque. Now, you don't add motor plus engine, so in this model, the engine alone is producing 603 horsepower. The 21 horsepower helps the engine get started from a complete stop, especially when the engine has been turned off, and it will also torque fill to help improve the overall feel of this out on the road. The motor also enables this vehicle to shut down the engine before it has come to a complete stop as you're rolling up to a stoplight. There are also performance benefits because the electric motor here will definitely improve the overall 0 to 60 time, and that's how this model will go 0 to 60 in 4.1 seconds or 3.7 seconds for the AMG 63S model. In case you're wondering, there's no factory hitch receiver on this model, but Mercedes tells us that all GLS trims, regardless of the engine choice, will be able to tow up to 7,500 pounds when properly equipped. As you'd expect out of the S-Class of SUVs, front seat comfort is excellent, and the seats do get a little bit more comfortable as we go on up the trim levels. We have a 3-position driver seat memory over there on the door, 3-position memory for the passenger seat as well. The seats are both heated and ventilated. These particular seats also massage, and there's some other features that we'll show you when we get to the infotainment system. We have a tilt-telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, and even though this model does have the panoramic moonroof, headroom is very, very generous. You can really tell by the outside of the GLS that the overall profile is definitely very upright. And if I were to put this seat cushion all the way down there to the bottom, I have probably about 4 or 5 inches of headroom left, sitting in a fairly upright position. So if you're a taller person, the GLS should be just fine. Hopping into the back seats, we also find very comfortable accommodations, although I think it's worth noting that I found the rear seat design in the second row of the BMW X7 to be just a little bit more comfortable than these seats. Now, there isn't more room in the X7. The X7, in fact, has 7 inches less legroom than we find in the GLS. This is absolutely enormous on the inside. And when you take a look at the chart on the side of your screen, you'll really see one of the advantages for the overall design of the GLS versus a body-on-frame SUV like the Lincoln Navigator. Hopping over to the middle seat position, we do find more room overall than we find in Mercedes' smaller SUVs, but again, this interior is not quite as wide, not quite as expansive as some of those larger truck-based SUVs that we see from the American companies. You'll really notice that when we start taking a look at center console widths. We have an enormous center console in those larger body-on-frame options. Moving all the way over here to the right side, you can see that this seat is definitely a little bit forward. We have this power recline mechanism. We can also move the seat cushion forward and backward, and even the headrest is power adjustable back here. And this particular model does have the optional 5-zone automatic climate control system. The model that we're driving is the 7-passenger version of the GLS, so it's a 3-person bench seat right here in the second row, 2 people in the back, and the second row is a 40-20-40 folding design. That's a really handy feature that I hadn't quite expected. If you're a family with young children, you'll be happy to know that you can leave a child seat or a booster seat affixed to the latch anchors in the second row and top tethered right there, and still tilt and slide those seats forward electrically. That's because of how Mercedes has designed the second row seats. The seat bottom cushion goes down to the ground and the entire seat as one piece tilts forward rather than collapsing on itself, which allows that child seat to stay in place. It's a very, very handy feature for people that do have child seats or booster seats in the family. Now, if I put the second row seat all the way back to where it was before, you'll notice that it does remember the headrest position right there. And then I use the door switch to slide it all the way back in its tracks, kind of squishing myself in the process here. Then you can see that overall legroom is a little bit tight, but that's with all of the seats all the way backwards in their tracks. And if I was sitting up there in the front seat, I had a ton of legroom left. I was really sitting in a very relaxed position. In the second row seat, I had about 7 inches of legroom left. So you can see that you can very easily apportion this space back here. And it is also worth noting that the default position for these second row seats pulls them back into a place where I have a reasonable amount of legroom back here. So by default, that's where the second row seat stops, unless you use the door switch to push it even further back, and that gives me about 1.5 inches of legroom. The third row and second row seats are all power folding. We press this little button right here to power fold those third row seats, and the headrest retracts itself automatically. The toggle right there behind helps you lower the air suspension to make cargo loading easier. And on the other side of the cargo area, we have an all switch, which allows you to fold all of the seats either up or down, depending on exactly what you're after. So you can see that's fold them all forward. So it power folds the second row right along with the third row. Now the exception, of course, is if that second row seat is in the access position that we see there, then it's not going to fold that one side. And then, of course, if you want them all back, we simply pull the toggle the other way, and all the seats return to their original position. Behind the third row, we find 17.4 cubic feet of storage space, which puts this almost exactly between the Lincoln Navigator and the BMW X7. We find 2 cubic feet more than the BMW, 2 cubic feet less than the Navigator. Of course, I'm talking about the short wheelbase Navigator, because if you get the long wheelbase Navigator or Escalade, then we get significantly more rear cargo room. That is one of the benefits for those enormous SUVs, but remember, they're also going to be significantly larger on the outside. If Mercedes had given us just 1 inch of extra length here, we probably would be able to fit 22-inch roller bags in this position. Under the load floor, we don't have a spare tire in this model because really one wouldn't fit under here, but we do have extra storage space. You can see we have somewhere to put this roller cargo cover. We also have a tray that holds things like the first aid kit, the tire inflator kit. You could also remove this if you want access to all of this storage and store them yourself under here. And if I pull that out of the way, you can see that we do have a pretty decently sized storage area. That is where they put the subwoofer right there on the side. As I usually say, keep in mind that we are not in the base trim when we take a look around this interior. So this is an optional large panoramic moonroof. You can see it goes to just about the second row passengers' heads right there. The third row passengers don't really have anything to look out. We do have the optional Burmester audio system here, so you can see that we have these extra speaker grills right there integrated into the ceiling. There's even a surround sound speaker right there in the ceiling just behind the second row seats to help improve spatial imaging for the second row passengers. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts, 4-way adjustable headrests. 2 ways are electric and 2 ways are manual, so we move this forward and backward manually with that button right there. Adjust the height with the electric controls on the door. Since we're driving the AMG model, we have an AMG logo right there in the middle of the seat back. Pretty aggressive bolsters. These are adjustable via the software in the infotainment system again. Heated and ventilated seats with perforated center sections. And as we move on over to the front doors, you can see that we definitely have a higher level of attention to detail than we've had in the GLS in the past. One of my complaints about the very first generation GL was that the interior didn't feel quite as premium as a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, but this is definitely a different story now. You can see that we have more of those metal speaker grills going on right up there at the top of the door. A lot of real wood trim going on here, even though we are in the AMG model. That is something that I like because I really do like open pore wood trim like this, even in sporty trims. A lot of stitched leather going on the doors. And then as we go down lower towards the bottom of the door, we do find one thing that we don't find in the S-Class, which is some hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door. That's mainly for overall durability. Hard plastics do tend to wear a little better. We have a bottle holder right down there at the bottom. All that stitched material continues as we move on over to the dashboard, where we have a stitched upper and lower section to the dashboard, and you can get the dash in Napa leather if you prefer. Again, more of that real wood trim. Leather wrapping right there on the glove box in this model. I was barely able to fit a 10-inch tablet computer inside. If we move over to the dashboard, we have large 12-inch screens, dual screens right there, one for the infotainment system and one for the instrument cluster right there in front of the driver. We'll take a look at those in a little bit. We have 4 air vents right there across the middle. This kind of mimics what we see in the Mercedes-Benz E-Class. Physical controls, so the front 2 climate control zones. This one does have a 5-zone climate control system, but most of that adjustment is done in the M-Bucks infotainment system. We have a roller cover over our wireless charger and 2 large cup holders right there. These are definitely large enough to accommodate large American-style takeout drinks, and they don't really hit anything in the process. Unfortunately, this little wireless charging mat here is just a tiny bit small, so it is a little bit tricky to fit some of the larger smartphones in it. We have 2 USB ports right there. One interfaces with the smartphone system. One is a charge-only or media port. We then have a touchpad for the infotainment system, no click wheel anymore. Drive mode selector right there, button for the 360-degree camera system, favorites button, direct car settings button right there, some buttons over here for navigation, media, radio, etc., the volume control for the system. Now, one thing that a lot of folks have asked me about is, how do I feel about the controls position right here relative to the cup holders there and drinks possibly splashing on them? I do think that is a valid concern. I kind of wish that Mercedes had located everything perhaps a little bit differently. And then down here behind this little wrist rest, we have the controls for the active exhaust system that makes it louder. The suspension, we can change between suspension modes there. Ride height, we can adjust it up and down. Stability and traction control, and then a manual mode selector for the transmission. This button opens the bifold doors right there for the center console, and you can see that for some reason I have a bottle of oyster sauce in there. There's definitely a lot of storage room going on in here all the way around. As you can see, M-Bucks offers smartphone integration, and this is a touch display. But for some reason, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay will only use the center portion of this 12-inch touchscreen LCD. It will never use the full screen. I'm not sure why Mercedes decided to do this, because they could very easily have kept just the home button on the side and made this display larger if they wanted to reserve some of the system screen for something else. This is entirely a Mercedes choice, however. This has nothing to do with Apple or Google as far as the way that the system is designed. We can either hit that Mercedes button right there, or we can hit the home button to get back to the home page. You can see that we have things like navigation right there, comfort settings, AMG specific options since we are in the AMG 63 version. We have track telemetry, drag race options right there. We also have the AMG performance screen where you can see engine readouts, right there, how much horsepower, how much torque the engine is producing. Getting to what I mentioned earlier about seat adjustments, there are a ton of different adjustments right here in the system. So for instance, we can automatic seat adjust. You can tell the system how tall you are and it will adjust the seat to a position that it thinks will be ideal for your size. I was surprised how well that worked for my height at 6 feet tall. I just typed it in there and everything was just fine. We also have the option to turn on and off the automatic belt adjustment, etc. On the seat comfort side, we have a new option called Seat Kinetics. This turns on the massage feature of the seat, but it also moves the seat in small ways. So it'll adjust the seat back and seat bottom cushion, moving them this way and that way to help reduce overall fatigue on longer journeys. The lumbar support adjustment is what I liked, I think, the most, though. This seems to be the way that Mercedes is going, and it really allows a lot more adjustment to the lumbar support than we see in other vehicles. This is where we would adjust the seat bolsters as well. I kind of wish those were hidden somewhere else. We have a seat heating balance, so you can choose whether you want the seat back or seat bottom cushion to be heated more than the other. The other LCD serves as the instrument cluster. You can see that things are styled so that way the two displays are right next to each other, and it kind of looks like Mercedes could go to one big screen later if they chose to. The display is highly configurable. You have a lot of choices as far as how information is displayed. You can see we have a bunch of different screens there that can be selected on the left side. The center right there at the moment has 3 different options. Then we have all these options over here on the right side. And if I hit the home button and I wanted to take a look at, for instance, AMG performance options right there in the middle, I can select some of those options to be displayed in the middle. Now the sides, left side and right side, aren't quite as configurable as far as what information can be displayed there in each individual drive mode. But we also have some different designs that we can choose from here. That's the classic mode. There's also a sport mode. See, we get a yellow theme right there. Basically the same sort of layout going on. There's almost always going to be this EQ power and charge gauge right there for the hybrid system. Or I can also go back and choose, for instance, the super sport mode. That is even more aggressive here. There's a full screen minimalist mode like we saw in the other screen layout. And things are definitely very modern here. We can choose, for instance, like the all-wheel drive system right there, so you can see what that would look like. And lastly, there's an understated option that gives you just a digital speedometer, clock over there, and then essentially turns off that center display. The steering wheel is a flat bottom design. You can see that we have sport grips up top, that flat bottom right there, and then large paddle shifters on the back. We have down on the left and up over here on the right. On the right side of the steering wheel, we also have volume up-down controls, dedicated phone buttons, voice command, and favorites button, but no track forward-backward buttons. That's still something that we see missing in modern Mercedes models. We have this BlackBerry-style controller that allows us to interact with that screen over there. It's the infotainment screen, and then a very similar one over here that allows us to interact with the instrument cluster. Below this side, we have another little LCD. This allows us to change our drive mode. You can see that it changes as I toggle through the drive mode there: Sport, Sport Plus, Individual, the off-road, sand modes, etc. But that's not as nifty as this little module on the other side of the steering wheel. This allows us to change things like our suspension ride height right there with the click of a button, the suspension mode, Sport or Sport Plus, or we can actually change what these buttons do. If I click in this area, you can see it's touch sensitive. We can toggle through different options, like if I want this to be exhaust loudness, I can click that button and have that be it. If I want this top section to be something like the manual transmission mode, I can toggle that button right there, or I can even set that to the AMG Dynamics option, or, for instance, turning off stability and traction control if that's something that you really wanted to do at the click of a button. And then above that, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system that this model has, and then again, the buttons for that multifunction instrument cluster right there. Overall, this setup is very attractive, and I appreciate the fact that Mercedes gives us a lot of choice. So you can control the system via this little controller right there on the steering wheel, or the one on the other side. You can also touch the LCD, or you can use this control pad right here in the center console. But I do have to admit that some of the choices that Mercedes made are a little bit baffling. So for instance, if I wanted to adjust my seat massage, I have to dig around here, or I can set a preset right there, so I can choose a favorite and have that hunt over there for instance, driver and passenger massage, things like that. But I don't have direct access buttons to features that I do wish I did. Let's get the performance numbers out of the way up front for the GLS 63, then we're going to talk about the rest of the GLS lineup. This particular model beat the manufacturer's estimate, and we clocked 0 to 60 in 4 seconds flat. That is positively impressive, bearing in mind that this weighs just shy of 6,000 pounds. About 5,850 pounds or so, according to the most recent specifications that I was able to find. And perhaps more impressive than that 0 to 60 time is the fact that if you get the GLS 63S, then that will go 0 to 60 about 0.2 of a second faster than this. And then there's the braking time. This stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 108 feet. That is shorter than the last Mercedes GLC that we tested, and that had some crazy wide tires for a compact crossover. Remember, this is about the size of the average American living room practically. Overall grip is also especially impressive with the GLS. This handles incredibly well, but it has a level of isolation from the road that you would expect out of a Mercedes-Benz S-Class. And again, that's logical since this is supposed to be the S-Class crossover. But it's obvious that Mercedes decided to tune the suspension towards the softer side of things. Now, this does have very low-profile 23-inch wheels and tires on it, so we definitely get a lot of suspension motion, a lot of those minor imperfections coming into the suspension, but the suspension does a pretty good job of canceling them out. Now, it doesn't do an excellent job, I would say. We definitely get more body motion into this vehicle than we would find in something like a Lincoln Navigator or a Cadillac Escalade. It is not that isolated. But if you're looking for a performance three-row crossover, then that's exactly what you want, because you can really drive this pretty hard, even in comfort mode. If we switch things over to the Sport Plus mode, then it definitely gets firmer, but this is never going to feel like an E-Class AMG. This is always going to drive a little bit bigger, a little bit softer, again, more along the lines of the S-Class. Now, that doesn't mean we have poor handling, but in an odd sort of way, Mercedes is masking the handling feel with the way that the rest of this vehicle has been tuned. When it comes to overall handling, I'm definitely going to give this an A+. If you compare this to any other large three-row crossover, handling in the GLS is absolutely excellent, and it is still very, very good even in the base GLS 450. The GLS 450 obviously is the mainstream version. It's not going to have the overall performance-rated tires or the enormous tires and wheels that we have on this model, but it still has a very nice tune to it in terms of overall handling ability. Mercedes has really decided to become, in some ways, the new BMW, in my opinion, and Mercedes has really focused on overall precision, driving dynamics, etc. We see that definitely in the GLS. Now, when it comes to the overall ride quality, I am going to have to give this model a B, and I suspect that it's mainly the wheels and tires that we have on this model. You can tell the suspension does have a very nice, soft, comfortable feel to it, but we're getting so much motion in the cabin from those low-profile tires and the 23-inch wheels that I think that helps disrupt things a bit. If you're looking for a more isolated, more serene drive, definitely don't choose the larger wheels. The larger tires and wheels will also have an impact on the cabin noise score. We clocked 71 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. In our test, road noise is a fairly important component, and these really wide tires, 325 with tires again in the rear, definitely have an impact on that. I was able to briefly test a GLS 450 with the base tire setup from a local dealer, and that was about 1.5 decibels quieter, about 69.5 decibels. That puts it right in line with what we see from the BMW X5 and of course the X7. And that is the model that most folks are going to be shopping for, so when it comes to overall cabin noise, I'm going to give this an A+ still. But definitely keep in mind that as you go up to the more performance-oriented versions of the GLS, overall cabin noise is definitely going to drop, as of course is fuel economy. We've been averaging 14.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. Now, we have been driving this in a very spirited fashion, so keep that in mind. Even though we have a cylinder deactivation system and a mild hybrid system, the GLS fuel economy numbers from the EPA are a little on the low side, in my opinion. I had expected things to be just a little bit higher in the GLS 450, but remembered that all versions of the GLS weigh over 5,000 pounds, and it is a pretty boxy shape. But what the GLS gives up for in economy, it definitely pays back in fun. On the pricing screen here, we see a combination of 2020 and 2021 pricing, because we know what the 2020 GLS model with the inline-six engine and with the base V8 engine are going to cost. We don't know what the 2021 models will cost, and the GLS 63 that we spent our time with this week was a 2021, not a 2020. Perhaps the biggest thing to know when you take a look at this pricing chart is that there really is no direct corollary to the GLS 63 out there. It's a full-on AMG model, and that's not what we see in the BMW X7 lineup that we'll talk about in a little bit. Not only do we have over 600 horsepower in the GLS 63, but we also have more of the same kind of AMG transformation that we see in other AMG models out there. So it's much more extensive than a mere performance package or just a performance bump. With that out of the way, let's dive right into the comparisons. The Audi Q7 obviously could be considered a direct competitor to the GLS. It was one of the larger options from Germany, but now it seems a little bit on the small side inside. The Q7 is also much more affordable. At $54,800, and as you'd expect with the more affordable price tag, it doesn't come across quite as premium. In reality, the Q7 was originally designed to compete with things like the BMW X5 in its 3-row format, or the Mercedes-Benz GLE with its 3-row. It wasn't really designed to be the next category up. And when Audi decided to make a more premium crossover, the Q8, they decided to not make that a 3-row crossover, so it doesn't really compete with the GLS or the X7 either. The big thing you'll notice between these two vehicles is that the Q7 is smaller on the inside. We don't get the same kind of legroom. It also ends up being, interestingly enough, a little bit less family-friendly, especially for kids and child seats. I was really surprised by the seating arrangement that we had in the GLS in the second row there, allowing you to keep those child seats latched into place. We also don't have the same kind of interior parts quality, fit and finish, etc., especially back in the third row, where you can really notice a huge difference between the GLS and the average 3-row crossover out there. Now that can be seen as a pro and a con, of course, because if you have your third row folded most of the time and you just put cargo back there, then a lot of those softer finishings and the more premium materials, they're really going to get banged up an awful lot back there by your cargo. But if you frequently actually carry passengers back there, then it is going to feel much more premium, and it's also going to be more comfortable for people in the Mercedes. Moving along to the X7, the X7 is much closer in price to the GLS. Obviously, this is the key competitor. They're both from Germany. There's a Mercedes, there's a BMW, obviously very, very direct competitors there. We also have an inline-6, and we also have a V8 engine. There is also sort of a performance version. We have an X7 M50i. Now this is not an X7M, and BMW is very clear on that. They claim they don't have plans to make an X7M. They think it's just a little bit too big, not in keeping with the M line of vehicles. The M50i is definitely quick and it unquestionably handles well, but it's not quite in the same league as the over 600 horsepower and absolutely insane handling that we have in the living room size GLS. And remember that the GLS gives us 7 inches more legroom than the BMW X7. Now that said, I really like the X7. I think I like the interior design in the X7 a little bit more actually than in the Mercedes-Benz GLS. I really love the model we last tested, which had the ivory and blue interior. That is obviously an optional package in the X7. Interior parts quality, interior fit and finishings is definitely at the same level that we find in the Mercedes-Benz GLS. Now we don't have all the same kind of features and options available in either of these vehicles, but they can be equipped relatively similarly, and when you do that, the X7 is going to be the better buy here. And for most shoppers out there that are really going to be focusing on the base engine, the X7 is also a little bit quicker 0 to 60. And lastly, although I like the new Mercedes-Benz infotainment system, I have to admit that I like iDrive just a little bit more. I found it a little bit more intuitive. There aren't quite so many different layers of menus to pull through in order to find the option that you want. And I also like the way that it displays Apple CarPlay and Android Auto just a little bit more than we find in the Mercedes. Next up, we have an interesting option, something like the Lincoln Navigator. Now, I'm not talking about the Cadillac Escalade here because we haven't driven it yet. It has been completely redesigned and we don't know all of the pricing details just yet. But in reality, I think that the new Escalade might be the more direct competitor once we finally can get our hands on it. Now, the Navigator is pretty expensive. It starts at $76,000, so it's about the same kind of pricing base range that we find in most trims of the GLS out on the dealer lot, and it will easily get over $100,000 if you get carried away with options. The big difference, obviously, is that the Navigator is a body-on-frame vehicle, the GLS is a unibody vehicle, so the two vehicles are going to handle very differently. They're going to have different characteristics. The Navigator definitely handles well for a body-on-frame vehicle, but not as well as the GLS. The GLS feels an awful lot more direct, a lot more connected to the driver out on the road, even though, again, it is absolutely enormous, whereas the Navigator has a softer, more isolated feel to it. Depending on what you're after, one might be good, one might not be. As far as parts quality, I think the Navigator competes very well here, although it doesn't quite reach what we see in the X7 or in the Mercedes-Benz GLS. It's an excellent effort from Ford. It is definitely miles ahead of the previous generation Navigator, and I think worth its $75,000 price tag. But when we start talking about $100,000 or $120,000, then obviously I'm going to want the interior that we see in the GLS or in the X7. I also think that some of that refinement applies to some of the features that we do find in common, features that we would have in the Navigator and have in the BMW or Mercedes. They're not quite as polished, not quite as refined in the Navigator. Now on the bright side, the Navigator's MSRP is high, but you are probably going to get a better discount on it on the Lincoln dealer's lot than you will on the GLS at the Mercedes lot. Of course, in reality, this really is a two-way battle, just GLS versus X7. I don't imagine the average GLS or X7 shopper out there is truly comparing the Audi Q7 or a Navigator or any of the other options that might be available in this segment, but GLS and X7 are definitely targeted very directly at one another. And in this battle, I have to admit that I lean towards the BMW. I like the BMW's overall design, both exterior design and interior design. I know some people have been a little bit offended by the beaver-like grille that we find in the X7. It is truly hungry and truly enormous, but I also think that it's not quite cartoonish like some people have said. I don't mind the look overall. I like the way the GLS looks as well, but it looks a little bit more sedate. It doesn't look quite as flashy. And if I was going to spend $100,000 on a big luxury SUV, I would want just a tiny bit of flashy in the overall design. But the GLS has significantly more legroom. It also has those very practical and handy second row seats. So it's a pretty close tie, but again, I think I would pick the X7 for the overall value. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. And of course, remember, you absolutely cannot go wrong with the GLS. I would say, especially if you are a family. I don't have kids in child seats, so that's part of why I would go for the X7. But if you do need to use that third row regularly and you do have kids in child seats, I think the Mercedes is definitely the winner here. Let me know what you think about all that down there. Find us at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Twitter, Instagram, all those other social things, and I'll see you later.